The Baroness finished with the phrase civil society, and that's where I start. And I would just like to try and remind you what civil society is, and it's really anything that's not government. You know, it's you, it's me, it's the institutions, it's the NGOs, it's the citizenry really that, you know, are really going to be the most powerful players going forward. And I do feel that civil society is picking up momentum because, you know, I feel there is a strong sense of social justice building up where things that aren't right are being picked up and being taken forward. And I feel that civil society has a crucial role to play in how we, as the construction industry and as we, the professions, try and eradicate modern slavery. And I'll hope to set out why I think the construction industry and allied professions need all the help we can get from civil society. But I think it's worthwhile me just sort of going through some of the dysfunctionalities that we do have in the industry, and I apologise to anybody who's heard this before. I think it's important, and you may say, why is a chief executive of a professional body being critical of professional bodies? Well, I think we've got good reason. And again, the Baroness made the point that if you don't think you're the problem, you are the problem. And I think professional bodies actually are part of the problem. And I'll cover that a bit later. So the construction industry, it does some great things, but it also does some less great things as well, as we all know. You see some of the fantastic buildings we put up there, but sometimes it's a bit uncertain of how we've got there. And, you know, my journey to all this started when I met people like Jill Wells from Engineers Against Poverty over in Qatar, looking at the issues of slave labour and abusive labour over there. And you know, it still haunts me to think that by the time they finish building all those stadiums, you could probably half fill one of the stadiums with the dead bodies of people who've been involved in building the stadiums for the FIFA World Cup. And that's actually quite a sobering thought, because that's probably 25,000 people. And when you associate that with all the families that are related to that, you're probably getting to nearly 250,000 people who get directly affected by some of the consequences along that line. So construction and ethical behaviour don't always seem to be happy bedfellows. And over my time here in the industry at the CIB, we've seen bid rigging, blacklisting, bribery, a tolerance to corruption. And when I say a tolerance to corruption, I really do mean a tolerance to corruption. A few years back, the CIB did a survey on corruption in the construction industry, and it was it was hopefully going to be a survey where it just asked a question, yes or no, but in the writing of it, they went a bit wrong, and we asked people to decide whether things were corrupt, slightly corrupt, moderately corrupt, or very corrupt. And the responses came back, and people said, yeah, that's slightly corrupt, and that's moderately corrupt, and that's very corrupt, as though you could actually rationalise and justify levels of corruption. We've also seen bribery, and other bad practices, you know, and one of those that sort of comes on, which I put down in the ethical thing as opposed to corrupt, is bait and switch. And that's a fairly common practice we have where, you know, we send teams out to bid, you know, and we have the A team go out and bid, and when we actually start to do the job, we put the B team or the C team, because then we use the A team to go and get other bids and what have you. And we have customers and clients who probably feel less satisfied than they did because they didn't get what they were thinking. And then alongside that, we've seen issues around labour, such as the growth of self-employment, bogus self-employment, and then the authorities play cat and mouse, because then we see the construction industry scheme come into play, IR35s, and it's no surprise then that, you know, there are holes in what we do and exploiters can flourish. And that gives the opportunity for modern slavery to happen. Now, this happens in an industry that has, I think the last time I did a count, there was 50 professional bodies and associations directly related to construction. And then you've got the other allied professions, you know, such as law and accountancy as well. Probably they account to another dozen as well. So how is it we have a situation where we have an industry stuffed with professionals that comes across sometimes at best as ethically deficient? You know, and that's pretty hard-hitting, but I have to say that's how it looks, and how it looks to people from outside the industry. And actually it comes across as how it looks from a lot of people from within the industry as well. It's one of the commonest things that comes to me. Is it because the various professional bodies that govern the professionals in the industry don't have codes of conduct and ethical behaviour? And I don't think it is, because I know, as far as I know, we all do. But I think sometimes that it's probably these various codes that are paradoxically often the main problem, and I'll say why in a minute. But let's look at some of the other contributors to the ethical problems. Our business model, for a start, the multiple levels of subcontracting covering everything from specialists to general labouring means that, for a start, there's very little loyalty in the supply chain. There's a high degree of anonymity as well, and visibility of what goes on at the lower levels tends to disappear. And although the industry employs in excess of 2 million people, 90% are employed in firms that employ less than 10 people. That's quite staggering, because most of you probably work for some big firms, but you're the rarity in the construction industry. And on a big site, with a major contractor, for example, you may find, no more than half a dozen people who are actually on the main contractor's payroll. The other 200 are on loads of other payrolls. And that's a reality. So as this supply chain expands, the risks of people being able to drive wedges into it and exploit the way the industry operates gets larger and larger. The other thing that doesn't help either is fairly low margins. In contracting, you get, make 2%, it's probably pretty normal. In bad times, it's less. And you could make up to 5%, except in house building. But as we all know, house building probably only represents 10% of construction. In government terms, house building is everything, but in the reality, it's actually a small part of what we do. So margins are low, some temptation is high. And then through the contracting process, the aim is to transfer risk as far as possible, usually from the strongest to the weakest. And this sort of washing our hands of problems, saying it's a subcontractor's problem, really indicates, a pretty lamentable approach to risk management, because we put the risk into the hands of the people who are least able to deal with it, whereas it should really be in the hands of the people who are best able to deal with it. And it also indicates indicative of an approach that assumes value engineering holds no risk. Now, I tend to think value engineering is more often the sort of the professional foul of the construction industry. It's not value, and often it's not engineering, it's just cost cutting. And it's one of those things that leads to the sorts of things that put pressure on the process. And I think the other thing is the unpalatable truth also is that often time and cost holds hostage everything else: quality, ethics, and morality. Now let me just turn to the codes of conduct. Most, by their very nature, deal with a relationship between the professional and the client. As long as things are legal, that's okay, and heaven help anyone who tries to interfere in or breach the relationship. As professionals, we deal with our clients, and to be honest, they come first. They're the ones who pay the bills, and they can be very good in that respect. So professionals are, by nature, very protective of those relationships. After all, becoming a professional has not been easy, nor should it be. In addition to experience, it requires a good education, and for members of chartered bodies, the Privy Council says, I quote, at least 75% of the corporate members should be qualified to first degree level standard, end quote. So, and also becoming a professional is also regarded as having a license to practice in some professions as well. So yeah, it's very important. But the relationship, I think, has its consequences, and you have to sometimes question whether that particular relationship, where people think they're working in the best interests of their client, you have to ask, is this really the case? Now, I'll do a couple of examples. And the first one is a non-construction example, which is, I should think, pretty well known, but let's just use it to make the case. You'll recall the case of Sir Philip Green and the British Home Stores Pension Fund. Now, it's pretty clear, and if you read the minutes of the Select Committee, very clear that his professional advisors thought they'd done a great job. What was being proposed was totally legal. They'd done their due diligence, and that was that. In construction, and the Baroness has referred to it, one of the most wearisome things I get questions on is I'm being asked by professional advisors, and I have to say sometimes lawyers, asking for the minimum their client needs to do to comply with Section 54. It's the 9-line response. Now, I actually think that's pretty shameful, that professionals are saying what's the minimum we can do, because I don't think that serves their clients at all. And we've already had the Baroness she could name and shame people, but she won't because, that's not what we're about, but it's not good enough. And the second most worrisome comment that's come up in the process of the Modern Slavery Act is that, people say, well, this can't possibly apply to the construction industry, because those who put the Act together really don't understand how our industry works, how complicated it is, and with the margins we make, how we're expected to do all of this, supply chain management. It's very much the same points that were raised with the Enterprise Act, which stamped on bid rigging and collusive pricing. It was also the same things that came up with the Bribery Act as well. Oh, this is too difficult for construction. We seem to be always being dragged into trying to do the right thing. So my point is really that the client-professional relationship tends to only look upwards to the client and not downwards to the consequence of the advice and actions that take place as a result of what goes on. In the BHS case, a perfectly legal arrangement turned into an intensely toxic matter. And I think it was probably totally predictable because although it was legal, it just looked wrong. It was indecent. And apart from the damage that Sir Philip Green has suffered, and probably his advisors, that toxicity has spread to all of the businesses and professional advisors because everyone thinks we're a bunch of crooks, which is not great. And this is this issue about where advisors must look at the downstream consequences of what they do. If professionals set themselves up to be something special, and we do, we've all got letters after our names and, most of us wear suits unless you're an architect, or ties unless you're an architect. But seriously, if we set ourselves up to be something special, then we have no excuses when we get held to account by civil society to say, you should know better. A society that grants privileges and status to professionals has every right to expect something in return, and that's responsibility. And I do believe that professionals and their professional associations, professional bodies, are not just there to help the rich and powerful become more rich and powerful. They have a duty to society at large to be mindful of any consequences their actions have for society at large. And in talking to people with vastly difficult political outlooks, the one common concept that all agree on is decency. And what's good for mine is probably good for yours. And some of those examples that I gave, the British Home Source thing, and trying to do the minimum regarding the Modern Slavery Act transparency stuff, actually is not decent. It's not what decent people would do. You'd expect more. And it's a sad thing, really, that decency can go out of the window in our business model. And the further down the supply chain we go, the further away it falls. And if the primary relationship at the top is one of distrust, greed, and indifference, then it infects the rest of the process. And really, as was said by one of my Irish colleagues, people don't give a bugger. Because that's what happens. And that's, again, the vehicle by which the crooks, the chancers, and so on, find a way into our industry and bring criminality into it. And expediency takes over from doing it right, shortcuts are taken, checks on people not followed through, and then we do have that exploitation situation. So how do we address this? Well, I really do think that the types of code of conduct that we have do need to be reviewed to see whether they really do meet the broader needs of society at large. There should be more emphasis on the downstream consequences and maybe free up and enable professionals to sort of draw a line and say, look, Mr. Client, we can't go there. And it is that issue between, what's legal and what's right and what's decent. And we need to be thinking about that. That bit of value engineering at the top that's going to, make a difference in someone's ideas of them getting good value for money could have consequences way down the line and could lead to disaster somewhere, but we need to be on top of all of that. And that really means these codes of conduct really need to have injected into them the moral compass. Now, it's very hard to define the moral compass. We probably all know it, but I keep coming back to this is about decency. Now, during the day, you'll hear other professional bodies explain how they're addressing the modern slavery issue. All I can say is that the COB, I'm not satisfied with what we're doing. I think we can do far more. I'm pleased my membership is engaged. I'm pleased that they've taken on board the opportunity to review our code of conduct and put in the moral compass, that modern slavery and trafficking is explicitly mentioned as things that, put you in peril of your professional membership, and that they're well engaged on it, but we can do more. We've also worked with Stronger Together, who you'll hear from today, and produced a supply chain toolkit, and I do believe it's more than a box-ticking exercise, and also an awareness film aimed particularly at sight people. And there is a consistent flow of messages aimed at raising overall awareness, but we can still do more. Now, back to the codes of conduct. I don't believe there is one simple code, and I don't think the professions I don't think it's right probably for the different professions to try and have, a homogeneous code, a bog standard code, because actually I think it misses what's special about the professions, but I do think they can have that one common feature, which is that issue about what does this mean? What does this mean for decency? Let's just forget about what's legal. Let's think about what's decent and look at the downstream consequences and leave the professions to deal with what's special in their relationships. Now, the second half of the statement from Privy Council I quoted earlier concludes, finally, both in the case of charities and professional bodies, incorporation should be in the public interest. And I think that's a continuing obligation. So in conclusion, I'd just like to challenge civil society, that's the NGOs, that's all of you, that's other professional bodies, really, that you need to hold our feet to the fire. And when I say our, the professions, hold our feet to the fire. And civil society does need to engage more to ensure that we as professions and professional bodies are accountable for what goes on. After all, civil society, that really does define the public interest. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.